In this video, I will show you the creation process of how I created this Qui-Gon Jinn 3D character in Blender. So Qui-Gon Jinn is my favorite Jedi and one of my favorite characters in Star Wars, so I thought it would be really cool to create a 3D character of Qui-Gon. And if you'd like to take a look at the final renders, then you can check out the finished artwork on my ArtStation profile, link to that will be in the description. And if you'd like to download the finished artwork files, then you can get that on my Gumroad store with the links in the description, and you can also get access to the artwork project files on my Patreon page. Now, I decided to go for a semi-realistic character, but still somewhat stylized. I wasn't really interested in making something with extreme realism, but I also didn't want something very cartoony or stylized. So I mostly focused on trying to get the likeness of Qui-Gon and have it semi-realistic, so trying to get the likeness, trying to make it look like Qui-Gon, but still generally having it a stylized character. In all of the resources that I'll be mentioning in this video, like textures or other tutorials, I'll have all the links to those in the description. So before I start creating any large artwork, I always start out by collecting a bunch of reference images. And to organize all my reference images, I really like using a program called PureRef. And PureRef will allow you to drag and drop images either from your file browser or from your internet browser into the program. And you can organize all the images and resize them and crop them. And I do have a tutorial on how to use PureRef if you'd like to check that out. So then I jumped into Blender and I started off by just adding an icosphere, and I subdivided it and then went into sculpt mode and started sculpting the head. And I do all of my sculpting on a Huion drawing tablet, and I have the Huion Canvas GT191, although that drawing tablet is one of Huion's older models, and so it's actually out of production, but their newer tablets are very similar to the one that I have. So I started off with very low geometry, and I'm just getting the very basic shape of the head. So I'm just making the shape of the jaw and the chin, and I'm also carving in where the eyes are and kind of bringing out the nose, and also flattening the side of the head. So now I'm adding just a little bit more detail, and I'm starting to smooth out the mesh a little bit more, but I'm still adding lots of different shapes. So I'm adding those creases there that go from the nose to the mouth, and adding more cheekbones and adding the wings of the nose, just adding a lot more details to the face. And then I'm using the remesh option right there to add a bit more geometry, and then just adding more detail. And then right here, I'm kind of giving an outline of where the ear is going to be and where the hair is going to be, just so that I can get an idea of where it'll be on the head. And then I'm adding more details to the mouth, and then I'm also starting with the eyelids. And I actually have a step-by-step sculpting tutorial on how to sculpt eyes if you'd like to check that out. And then I used Blender's mask brush. I also have a tutorial on how to use Blender's mask brush, and I just added a mask to the back of the head where the neck is going to be, and then I inverted the mask, and then I used the snake hook brush just to pull out the neck. And then I'm just kind of sculpting the shape of the neck, and then going along there and kind of thickening up the neck and adding a little bit of the anatomy to the neck. And whenever I'm sculpting faces, I usually also bring up some reference images of skulls because I want to see the underlying shape underneath the head. And that helps me to get a more realistic head sculpt. And I don't want to add too many details, but I am adding a few creases and things on the face, but the proportions are still very off, and so I don't want to add too many details to the head. And now I'm going back and adding more shape to the lips, and also giving a bit more shape to the nose. So then for the eyes, I added a new object, so I added some UV spheres, and then I added a mirror modifier to them and just stuck them in the eye sockets. And then I'm just kind of sharpening up those eyelids and making them fit the eyes. And then I wanted to get started with the hair, so I added another sphere, and you can see it's very low detail, and I'm just using the grab brush to just kind of shape the basic shape of the hair. Now I considered making a more realistic hair using the particle system or the hair with the geometry nodes, but I decided just to sculpt the hair because I'm not going for a super realistic character, I am going for a somewhat stylized character, and also I do just enjoy sculpting, so I thought it would be a cool challenge to sculpt the hair. And also I find using particle hair to be pretty fiddly. I find that I'm always combing the hair and then it's kind of shooting up in random directions, and I just find it kind of hard to use and not as enjoyable. So I'm adding some details to the hair, but I'm mostly just focusing on the overall shape because I know I'm going to need to perfect the proportions later. And then I wanted to add some basic colors to the viewport, so I gave each of these objects different materials, and then I went down to the viewport display and I changed the viewport color. And this way it helps just to look a bit more like a character. And then I also added another sphere, and this sphere I kind of shaped around the jaw to make the beard and the mustache. And then I just started doing some very basic sculpting. And I'm not adding a ton of detail right now, I just want to get the main shape. And also sculpting out that object to create a small mustache. And then I went back to the main hair object and started to add a bit more detail, but then you can see I jumped back over here and started to sculpt more of the ear. And I think it's actually a pretty good workflow to not spend too much time on any one part of the artwork, because you might spend a ton of time working on one part and you might make it look really nice, but then the rest of the face may not turn out that good and you may want to resculpt the entire thing, or you may need to change the proportions around, and if the object is very detailed then you might lose some of the detail, or it may be hard to change the proportions. So I think it's a good workflow to go around and sculpt different parts of your character and not spend too much time on one part. So now I'm really paying close attention to my reference images and I'm really trying to get the likeness of the face. And I do find sculpting character likeness to be pretty challenging, but it was really good practice. So I'm looking at many different angles of Qui-Gon's face and really trying to get the likeness, trying to get the proportions correct, and just get it to look as much like Qui-Gon as possible. Now right now it looks a little bit more like a stylized or cartoony Qui-Gon, maybe the Qui-Gon in the Clone Wars, but not the Qui-Gon from the live action films. And I think some reasons for this is that the cheeks are coming in a little bit too much, the eyes are also a little bit too big, and then the cheekbones also come out a little bit too much. And also I just needed to perfect the proportions a bit more. But I decided to take a break from the sculpting for now because I wanted to model a bit more of the character. So I added a cube, and then I added the mirror modifier and also a subdivision surface modifier, and I just modeled the basic torso. And then I applied those modifiers and I went into sculpting and I just started to sculpt Qui-Gon's torso. Now at this point in the creation process, I really wasn't sure exactly what I needed to do to make the face look more like Qui-Gon. So what I did is just added a reference images of Qui-Gon into Blender, and I put the reference image in front of the sculpt, and then I turned the opacity down and I aligned it up with my sculpt. And then I went into sculpt mode and I started to shape the sculpt to the face. Now some people might consider this cheating because it's kind of like I'm tracing over the image, but I was using this as a way to self-critique and to find my mistakes. And immediately I realized that the eyes were too big and I noticed some other proportion mistakes. So then I went back to the sculpt and I adjusted the proportions quite a bit, and very quickly the sculpt had a lot more likeness of Qui-Gon. So this was very helpful to improve the sculpt and to also notice my proportion mistakes. Of course, I'm sure there are still many ways that it could be better, but I was pretty happy with it for my skill level. So because I was happy with the face, I wanted to continue creating the rest of the body. So I added a cube, and I gave that cube a mirror modifier and a subsurf modifier, and I just modeled some basic arms, and then I went into sculpt mode and I started to sculpt the basic shape of the arms. And I could have used some sort of cloth physics, or I could have used some other method to create the cloth, but I do really enjoy sculpting and I wanted to mainly focus on sculpting for this character, and I thought it would be a great challenge to try to sculpt the cloth. Then I added a cylinder and I modeled that around his waist, and then I started to go along and sculpt more of that object. And then I added another cube, and I also gave this a subsurf modifier, and I added some loop cuts to model the bottom of his torso. And then I started sculpting that object as well. So I then wanted to start modeling Qui-Gon's belt, so I added a cylinder and I deleted the top and bottom faces, and I just scaled the cylinder down to fit where his belt would be. And then I deleted half of the object and added a mirror modifier, and then I used the proportional editing to make the belt go around his waist. And then I also added a cube for the belt buckle. And then I still needed to add another object to create kind of that shirt underneath his Jedi robes. So for that, I just added a plane and I added a mirror modifier and just modeled the object. And then after that, I gave it some thickness, and then you can see right here I'm adding some loop cuts, and I extruded those loop cuts in to create that little crease in the shirt. So I wanted to kind of shift gears and work on something else for a while, so I decided to start modeling Qui-Gon's lightsaber. So I did this in a completely separate Blender file, and I just found a reference image of Qui-Gon's lightsaber, and I just put this as a reference image into Blender, and then I started modeling. So you can see right here I added a cylinder, I added the array modifier to array the object and make that little detail in Qui-Gon's lightsaber. Then I also added some more cylinders, and I just started to model the rest of Qui-Gon's lightsaber, and just kind of following along the shape of the reference image. So this was really quite easy to model. And then also modeling that big red button there to ignite the lightsaber. And then I just started adding a few materials, and I added in an HDRI to get some realistic lighting to see how the lightsaber was looking. Now I did want to add a bit more detail to the material of the lightsaber, and so what I wanted to do is add some edge wear to the material. I added the ambient occlusion node, and I added a color ramp to make the ambient occlusion much more contrasty. And you can see by doing that, the ambient occlusion gives these little white areas areas to the edges of the lightsaber. But then I wanted the edge wear to look a little bit more noisy and random, so I used a mix node and I mixed the ambient occlusion with a noise texture. And then I added two different principled shaders, so one of them was the black material and then one of them was the shiny edge wear, and then I used the ambient occlusion mask as the factor to control where both of the materials are. And so you can see now the edges of Qui-Gon's lightsaber looks a little bit worn away and kind of shiny. And then I wanted to add a grippy texture to the button, so for that I added a Voronoi texture and I turned the randomness of the Voronoi texture all the way to 0. And that way it gives us those little black dots with the white lines. And then I mixed that into a bump map to control the bump, and then I also gave it a shiny red metal material. So there is Qui-Gon's finished lightsaber, and you can also see there's a little bit of variation in the roughness of some of that lighter metal, and that was just a noise texture which was going into the roughness. So now I went back to the other blend file and I decided to add some more details to Qui-Gon's belt. So I modeled the belt buckle, and that was pretty easy to model. I just hand modeled that with a cube, and then I also added another plane and just scaled that plane down, and I added a mirror modifier to it and I started to model the leather belt. And then also gave that a solidify modifier so that it is thicker, and I kind of wrapped it around the belt buckle. And then I imported the lightsaber model from my other blend file into the Qui-Gon file, and I just stuck the lightsaber on his belt. And then to fit the rest of the scene, I gave the lightsaber a few basic viewport materials. So then I started the lighting, so I started adding some HDRIs and also added some area lights and just pointed the lights at Qui-Gon and just started to play around with the lighting to see what lighting I liked. And I tried adding a green lighting because I thought that might look cool for Qui-Gon, because Qui-Gon has a green lightsaber, but I thought the green looked a little bit alien and a little bit abstract and weird, so in the end I just went for some blue lighting because blue lighting is kind of the color of a Jedi, and blue is also a more natural light. And then I started with the fabric material. So I just decided to use a noise texture, and I made the noise texture very detailed and small, and I added it into the normal to give it some bump, and that added a nice little soft fuzz to the cloth material. And then I added a material for the leather belt, and for that I actually used my procedural generic leather, and I have a tutorial on how to create that leather material. But I wanted to make the leather look like it was a bit worn on the edges, so I added the geometry node and I used the pointiness value, and then I added a color ramp to make the pointiness value more contrasty. And then I also added the ambient occlusion node, and I mixed the pointiness value with the ambient occlusion together with the mix node to make some of the areas lighter and other areas darker. And then I mixed that into the procedural leather material, and I made some areas of the leather a bit lighter, and that way it makes the leather look like it's a bit worn. And then I added a cube and just modeled some basic eyebrows onto Qui-Gon's face. Now up to this point I had just added a shiny black color and a shiny white color for the eyes, but Qui-Gon Jinn has bright blue eyes, and so I wanted to add a bright blue texture to the eyes. So I downloaded this free image here from pixabay.com, and then I UV unwrapped the eyes and I stuck that eye texture onto the eyes. And then I also used a color ramp and a mix node to kind of edit the texture of the eye and make it look a bit brighter. And then I wanted to add a highlight in the eye to make the character look more alive, so for that I added an area light, and I just pointed the area light at Qui-Gon, and that way his eyes kind of reflect that area light. And then I also wanted to add a bit more contrast to the cloth, so I added another ambient occlusion node and I mixed that with the texture of the cloth to make the edges of the cloth look a bit darker. And I do think adding that ambient occlusion to the cloth makes it look quite a bit better. Then I jumped over to the eyebrows and I started to sculpt the eyebrows. So I'm just using the clay strips brush and also the crease brush just to kind of add some details to the eyebrows. And then for Qui-Gon's skin, I started out by just adding my procedural skin material. And I do like how that procedural skin material looks, and it got the skin most of the way there, but there are some areas on the face where the skin is a bit more pink, like around the eyes and also on the lips. So what I did to create those pink areas is I did Vertex painting on Qui-Gon's face. So I went into Vertex paint, and then the Vertex paint starts out as white, and I just painted some little black areas where I wanted the skin to be more pink. So you can see I'm just painting a few areas like on the forehead and on the cheeks, and then I'm also adding a very dark color to the lips. So I'm basically creating a mask of where I want the skin to be more pink. So after I did the Vertex painting, I added in the color attribute node. and I used the color attribute node as the factor to mix between two different colors. In this way I didn't have to worry about UV unwrapping or doing texture painting of the skin. I was just able to create a mask and then make that pink color. And then I wanted to make the hair stand out a bit more, so again I added the geometry node and I used the pointiness value, and then I added a color ramp to make the two colors for Qui-Gon's hair. And the pointiness value basically makes the creases of the mesh look darker, and the parts of the mesh which are coming out are going to be lighter. And so that gave a lot more depth to Qui-Gon's hair. And then playing around with the lighting and make sure I liked how the lighting looked. And then after I rendered the image, I did a little bit of compositing, so I added a denoise node to denoise the image, and also a glare to make some of the lighter areas have a bit of a glare. And then I also wanted to add a vignette to make the edges a bit darker, so for that I used a box mask, and then I blurred the box mask, and then I used an alpha over node to mix the blurred box mask with the image, and that way it made a little dark vignette around the image. And then before rendering the final renders, I did want to break the symmetry a little bit, so I actually went into sculpt mode of the face and I changed the expression a little bit, so one of the eyebrows is a little bit higher up, and I also changed the symmetry of his mouth a little bit, and then I also rotated the eyes around so that Qui-Gon is looking off to the side of it, and that just kind of breaks the symmetry of the face and makes it look a bit more natural and realistic. So I'm sure there are many ways this could be improved. I still have a lot to learn when it comes to creating character art in Blender, but overall I was really happy with the final renders. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to download the finished project files, then you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. Now before I end the video, I wanted to leave you with my favorite quote from Qui-Gon Jinn: "Your focus determines your reality." So thank you for watching, and I hope you got something out of this creation process video.